religion topic is brought to you by Disgusting Drinks and Letter B.
So what I wanted to do in our podcast is sometimes introduce a product that food item that I'm pretty sure I know I've had. James has probably had, and Josh has probably never had.
But I've had this.
But you've had it. But I knew you'd hate it, so that's still why I got it. We're gonna try some kombucha, which is a probiotic drink made with a SCOBY, which is symbiotic culture of yeast. And
You just said a bunch of stuff that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Was any of that on the list of things we eat from a few weeks ago?
You can find the symbiotic stuff in beaver anus for sure.
So
It's the gland,
I used to
not
make
the anus.
kombucha
Same thing.
in various flavors, and we're just gonna.
You used to make your own kombucha?
Yeah, all the time. It's once you buy it a lot.
You just save your spit.
This does not pour very well. Tell your wife, Chris, I'm sorry about the tablecloth. I got some kombucha on it.
Hey,
That's
just
all right.
for the record,
It's our
we've totally
all-new, all-gold tablecloth.
I tried really hard.
It's all gold because we're huge here. We're huge
It's because I
winners.
poured it like within the lip
huge
of the cup.
gems.
Like this bottle was $5. What in the world?
No,
It doesn't want to be consumed. That's how bad it
gotta
is. It's
boldly
trying to tell
pour.
you itself
Boldly
not
pour.
to consume it. And then twist it to the side.
This
when you're
bottle was
done.
like $5, and so once you start drinking, you're like, man, I can't afford to buy kombucha, and so you just make it yourself.
Rotate it as you're done, like you're pouring wine. There you go.
Okay, that's way too much for you because you'll.
I'm
You can give me more than that.
I will. We can finish this
I
bottle.
mean, I'm sure
off.
it's gonna be terrible, but I'll drink through. And the rest.
Did you try it?
That's so bad. I
You
just
almost
smelled-
just puked on my rug.
Cheers. So kombucha is very good for you because there's probiotics in it. I'm not gonna cheers you because you're gonna vomit it.
Wow, that's
Alright.
a smell.
Don't puke on my rug.
That was awful. Nope. I'm done. That's
pretty good.
You can have the rest of it.
No, that's not bad at all.
No, you're a liar. It's so bad. It smells like
It does-
barf.
Actually, it smells like vomit, but it doesn't taste like vomit.
Yeah, it does smell a little bit of vinegary and fermented.
It smells like beehole, dude. It just smells like fermented beehole.
So we'll enjoy this treat while we talk about a religion topic.
That's so gross.
And I could talk about kombucha all day. So
so gross.
I need Chris to get in on this.
All right.
How does kombucha feel in your nose, James?
I smell a lot more clearly now.
Roughly the equivalent of beehole in your nose.
I got a local brand from LA that we.
So speaking
support
of
local.
things that you should never expose your kids to, our religion topic today
Kids shouldn't drink kombucha. By the way.
is whether or not we should. Wait, really? They shouldn't?
Because of the bacteria and yeast. If you're younger, then probably don't quote me on this, but
What a
3 or 4.
dangerous drink. You just buy this at the store.
Guys, I can smell it like.
It says do not shake ever. It's so threatening.
In the same sense that infants shouldn't have honey because bacteria lives on honey.
Seriously, I'm going to move it outside or something. If you don't consume that fast, it's going to make
Chris.
me hurl.
You got a glass.
No.
No, I'm fine.
No, don't do it, dude. It's the worst.
My wife's a fan. I'm familiar.
Oh, God, it
I
smells
could have
like.
brought the beet kombucha. But
It just smells old. It's making my.
I think it actually
Smell my
tastes like
fingers. smell my finger.
Never smelled Josh's fingers.
So gross. Smell it, dude. It's so awful.
stinky pinky.
it actually tastes like an odd champagne. Is it? Yeah, champagne. That's what it is.
Super bubbly and effervescent.
No, you're mispronouncing. I think it's champagne.
Champagne.
So
As
God, that was
Christopher Walken. I was gonna say Mr. Walken.
It's so bad it distorts your speech. That's how terrible this drink is.
We can talk about we'll talk about probiotics sometime. Talk about where they're really good for you, and you probably need more.
We will not discuss any of that on my podcast. No, it's so gross, dude.
Sounds like a superhero. Probiotics.
probiotic man. Okay, so the religion topic. Thank you for that.
Good. I'm glad that you liked having that segment on the show.
I really didn't, but I'm gonna go stop this and puke outside. Our religion topic today is centered around this discussion of whether or not we ought to, and maybe are we, reading the Bible to children. Okay, so James and I have long talked about this, and we wanted to bring you guys in on the discussion. We have found. I don't ever want to discourage the work of children's ministries just in the greater church at large because I think they do a lot of great things. I'm very grateful for my teachers with whom I'm still in contact with to this day. And so I have a great love and respect for the teachers that have helped me and molded me and really shaped my spirituality growing up. I committed my life to Jesus Christ when I was 6, and I had a decent understanding for what a 6-year-old can understand in that, and that was by and large due to my parents and also the people that taught me that when I was 6, I could tell you what it meant to be somebody who is in need of God's grace and love, and that Jesus came to create that way for me and us in general. But there are certain things in Scripture, particularly in our Old Testament, right, in the Hebrew Bible, that are difficult to deal with and that are topics that are difficult to cover. So I'm looking at right here on my computer, on my MacBook Pro, so eloquently displayed, and my
I don't think you're allowed to
fantastic
say Apple products
Retina display.
out loud.
No, I can
on a
say it.
podcast.
I can say it because I own it. They don't sponsor
That's not
us.
how that works.
They don't sponsor us in any way.
If we made it this far after our earlier conversation.
Yeah, dude, we're totally okay.
You
So
you'd have to say MacBook. You can't say actually Mac.
Acbook May. All right, so I will speak I missed it. Never mind. So we go through these children's lessons sometimes, and we kind of gloss over some of the difficult parts. And I wanted to kind of dive into that, and really, when it comes right down to it, the reality of teaching is that everybody kind of cherry picks. Everybody does a little bit of picking and choosing. Everybody favors one attribute of God over the other to some degree. And there's just biases that we have as humans that aren't necessarily good or bad. They just are. I obviously think my biases are better than other people's. And so when it comes to difficult stories like in the Old Testament, my question is, and I think our religion topic for this week is, are we doing a good enough job of teaching the whole Bible to children and the difficulties that come with that? Or are we kind of circumventing some of the more difficult stuff and doing kind of story pieces, right? Things picking and choosing that look good on a flannel board per se that may not, teach very well. So I'm looking right here at a story of Noah and the flood as depicted in a children's book. And there's just 6 questions on there. What did Noah escape? Why was God so brokenhearted? Why did God provide an escape for Noah? Who escaped with Noah? How long did God wait for people to change? How did Noah escape? So those are the 6 questions. The answers are Noah escaped God's wrath. The earth was filled with evil. That's why God was brokenhearted. He was the only righteous man, so that's why God let Noah escape. He got to escape with his family. 120 years for people to change, and God told him to build an ark, and that's how he has escaped. And there's a lot of the story that's being glossed over there, and you can probably make the argument that it's hitting the highlights there, and I think that would have to be the way that I would answer this, just very quickly to start the ball rolling for the discussion, that we hit the highlights for the kids, teach them the basics of the story, and hopefully, as they get older, we go back and revisit them and dig into them deeper. So, James, why don't you go ahead and start us off with some of your thoughts? And remember, we're talking adolescence here, 0 to 11, 0 to 12.
Well, and let's just, for the record, who has kids here? Well, I know. It's a podcast. If you raise your hand, it's not going to be very helpful.
I do. James Yule.
And that was Josh. That raised his hand. Just kidding, that was me. We saw stuff in the camera. I thought that's good enough.
Kombucha distorts your brain cells. It's so bad for you.
So there goes that sponsorship.
Okay, it's only the 7th episode, all right?
So, having kids, I've seen and observed my children in various ministries and watched the Bible be taught to them. And what I've seen over and over and over again is the Bible stories are not really ever taught as the stories are told. They're always watered down. Right? The really tough facts are always taken out of them, so we don't scare the kids with them, or we don't give the kids unanswerable questions that we're uncomfortable answering for them. And that sort of disturbs me. I think to myself, well, if you're going to teach, the story of Jonah or Noah or Samson or whatever, and I say, well, why do you take these facts out? And then the answer would be, well, because kids aren't ready for them. And then my answer would be, then why are you teaching the story? There are parts of the Bible that you could teach to a kid. A lot of the parables of Jesus are totally fine. Like, you can cover those parables completely and fully, and they could come to good lessons for children. There are parts of the Bible that are fine for kids. But there's a lot of parts of the Bible that are very adult. And for some reason, we want to teach these adult tales and remove the substance of them when we teach them to kids. And we're not then teaching the Bible anymore. We're teaching some kind of stripped down skeleton of the Bible. That sort of bothers me a little, honestly. I think that... So I can't speak for all Jews, but I know of some Jewish synagogues, some Jewish teaching situations where they don't really teach the Bible, in their case, the Hebrew scriptures, to children. I mean, they teach them about Judaism. They teach them about very important principles, and they maybe do a couple of stories from the Hebrew scriptures. But they treat the Bible as something you grow up into. Right? When you're coming to like the age of adulthood, you're growing into the age when you can really engage the biblical text from their perspective. I kind of wish in the Christian church we did something similar. There's some Bible stories you can totally teach, but for the most part, I wish we would handle the Bible as an adult book that people have to sort of grow into instead of trying to make it into a children's book. And there's two reasons for that. There's two things I don't like the way we do it. One is because we force the Bible into being a children's book, people grow up thinking it is a children's book. And they have a hard time as adults treating, like even perceiving it as anything but child religion. And you can see that in the internet. You can see that in a lot of public discourse places where people come with the presumption.
They grew up and they put away the fairy tales.
They can't believe
Yeah.
that the Bible is so violent.
Or
throwing
it's
that
just
in the
adult.
face of Christians.
It's for them, it's an immature thing to even read because it was treated immaturely in their youth. And the other thing is, for those people who do take the Bible seriously or it becomes very important to them, I've seen this in the college classroom where I teach Bible. I've seen this in the church when I'm dealing with very adult texts. Suddenly, people realize they never knew this story. And it becomes distressing to them. I didn't know that's what was going on in that story. I didn't realize of these certain facts. And now they come into almost like a mini faith crisis because they never really knew the Bible to begin with. And these are two things that come out of the way I think we sometimes handle the Bible with kids. Two things that are easily avoidable, I think, if we just treat the Bible differently. And I'm going to get off my rant for a second, like Garrett, who actually works with youth of various ages more, and see what he thinks about this.
I agree with you. I think that I'll come from a ministry perspective. I think it's really challenging for families and the culture to expect children's ministry professionals or children's pastors to teach children Bible stories in an age-appropriate way. Now, when I say it's difficult to expect that, they all do that. I mean, you can pick up any curriculum, any VBS curriculum, and they're going to be going through some Old Testament stories and teach them very similar to the way that you described, watered down. I don't really like that. I think I wish children's pastors were more focused on spiritual development and discipleship.
So what does spiritual development look like then, apart from watered down? What would be like a suggestion for something like that?
So probably a lot more focused on how to care for people, love people, live like a Christian, how to follow Christ, as opposed to memorizing Old Testament Bible stories and Bible verses, service opportunities, examples of helping each other, examples of living like Christ, as opposed to homework workbooks where they're coming back with filled-in correct answers to multiple choice questions on Old Testament stories. I think that those are important things, but at one point, it's too young for that to begin with, and you're just teaching them something that either A, they'll forget, or B, you have to reteach them the actual story. And the reason why it was included in the Bible was to show us God's wrath. You're going to have to reteach that at a certain age, which typically falls on Josh and I as youth pastors working with junior high and high school students.
Which is super frustrating.
They know hopefully they know the names of the people in the Bible. And so when you talk about Moses as a baby, you're like, oh, he was in a reed bassinet or raft, or whatever, in the water because his mom wanted to give him over. No, that was pretty much she just thought he was gonna die, get eaten by a Nile crocodile.
That rhymes.
Nice rhyme.
Or literally,
That was my stage name in high school. The Nile crocodile.
Literally,
Bing, bang, boom.
his options were this was a literally last ditch effort where it's going to die anyways.
That death by the wilderness would somehow be better than being murdered
Right.
at the hand of Pharaoh. I mean, those are the two options there. Which one's the lesser of two evils?
Correct.
That's
And
what
I'm
his
just using
mother
that
had to
example, and the
choose. That's a
students-
great, yeah.
So it's
Hey,
like,
Chris.
oh, I didn't know
I
that
can
she
totally
was
hear you.
Oh.
giving up her child to die, And I'm like, well, that's how desperate she was, and that's the part. That's the reason why we learn that part, is to learn about how desperate she really was, and that through God's power and grace, He saved his life. So
Yeah.
I had to reteach that, and I do that. We do that all the time. Why don't the parents maybe teach these Bible stories in a way that they think it's appropriate, and when they think they're ready? And those in ministry will teach the students what it means to live like Christ and what it means to serve one another and love one another. And not that we won't ever teach the Bible, but those principles are a lot better taught at home, I think, in a family setting, than to expect us to be able to know when they're ready for that and how to teach that in an appropriate way for every student who happens to be there on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, I'll give you a personal example. When I was a young kid, my parents bought me a child's Bible that focused a lot
Salty the Psalm book.
With a P.
It was a
Do you remember
really
that?
large
Yes.
Bible. I still have it, actually. Really hefty with really nice pages and artwork through it, and focuses on like sort of the major.
Is that the
tales
one
of
where
the
Adam and Eve are white like me?
Probably.
Actually,
Classic.
memory. I haven't looked through it in a few years, but last time I looked through it, I was surprised by how, I guess, sensitive to ethnicity it was. It was. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it was much better than I
Is
expected.
that code for saying there were more black people than you thought there were going to be?
Anyway, so
Yes.
so the point I'm getting to is I used to, as a kid, read the story of Samson in this Bible, and Samson is, he's like almost like a biblical G.I. Joe. He's manly.
Superhero.
He fights a
Cobra Kai.
lion. And it goes through the main points of Samson's story, but it takes out just the right facts not to see what the adult tale is there.
Right.
And it gets and I used to just love this story of Samson. I was so affected by it as a young boy.
What did you think the story was about?
About just this awesome,
Just redemption?
tough guy for God,
Okay.
right? Tough guy for God.
Yeah.
And there's no redemption story, as if he in this
Oh.
telling. It's how this really good-looking tough guy for God achieved all these things out of his faith, right? And it was very affecting to me. Now, as an adult, when I
Are you
returned-
saying there was no redemption story in the story that you read as a child?
Right.
Got it. Okay, yeah.
Now, when I returned to this tale as an adult, and there's a there was a gap when I didn't think about my faith. So coming back to these tales was very much coming back to some of my youth. And I re-engaged the story of Samson. Samson's not a good person in Judges. Samson is an example of an awful human being who makes terrible decisions, and he is.
Tell me how to take your power, and he just gives her whatever she wants. Well, lies to her over and over and over again.
Well, I would argue that Samson and Samuel, who of course is in 1 Samuel, are actually designed to be negatives of each other. Samuel is everything Samson should be.
Mm-hmm.
Samson is all the things a judge shouldn't be.
Right.
And when you follow the adult facts, Samson is an awful human being whom I shouldn't have been looking up to as a youth. Now, I engaged that in the college classroom when I came back to that, and I was able to come to it with an adult senses. But I've known people who weren't afforded the situation I had, and the internet made them aware of the things Samson did. And here's what happens when you kind of get hit with this landmine of information from a source that's not trying to construct your faith. Here's what happens. Oh, that's Samson you look up to, the good example in the Bible. Here's how bad he is. Therefore, the Bible is giving you a bad example that you're looking up to. Therefore, now this is the Bible's fault, right? The Bible is teaching you incorrectly, when in fact the Bible is attempting to give a bad example, right? But it was this book, this child's Bible, that trained me to look up to Samson. And similar things train this other person to look up to Samson, and therefore became sensitive to this landmine of information later on. Whereas if I had been either not taught about Samson, or taught from the beginning when I was able to understand the adult tale, then this wouldn't have been a problem.
Is anyone even doing? I mean, what you talk about when you were a child is still so prevalent in every curriculum that I know of, and we're both kind of. We'll get, I guess, your view in a second, but right now it's not important. We're in agreement that it's doing a
I haven't
disservice.
said anything for 5 minutes, and you just took a pot shot at me.
We
well
both
done.
agree it's doing a disservice
This is really well
Right.
played.
as opposed to helping the child. I mean, what is out there that's going to help the child, Josh?
Yeah, I think this stems really. So there's two questions at work here. The first one being to the point that you raised in your understanding of those types of ideals being taught better in the home. The question then becomes the greater biblical literacy of our congregations at large in there. And so that answers in part your question about why it's not being taught in the home.
They don't feel comfortable.
Yeah, because our
if they don't.
adults don't necessarily feel qualified or capable, and they don't want to screw it up. And so I typically think the non-teaching comes from the best of intentions of saying, I don't study the Bible as a career, or I'm not as eloquent in my speech, or I can't teach it as well, so I'll leave it to the pastor. And so I think it comes from a good place most of the time, or they just honestly don't spend enough time in their word and, blah, blah, blah. And so I've actually tried to adopt this model or this understanding on a two-front thing where I don't use other curriculums for teaching and stuff. I work very hard at coming up with, all original sermon ideas, obviously, which doesn't work all the time. So, we borrow stuff we kind of from other people, or we meet together like we do, in the middle of the week to get, tips and just what we're working through. And so one of the things that I've actually adopted in my own ministry setting is not ever having, anything be off limits there. So I've discussed a multiplicity of views on, I don't know, something like creationism or evolution and kind of teaching students how to think as opposed to what to think. And this can get a little dicey. I mean, obviously you have to be very careful. You still want to give people a chance to grow up in their faith tradition, and you don't want to necessarily pull the rug out from under them, and you don't want to obviously blatantly teach something that your church doesn't believe, or that you're not assigned.
Yeah, and on that point, never take pleasure in deconstructing somebody's beliefs.
No, and that's a terrible thing to find joy in. And honestly, I don't know. I mean, if you're doing it maliciously, it's kind of a mean thing to do. There, when people are trying to learn sincerely, if somebody's being a jerk there and flaunting that,
Then take all the pleasure.
Yeah, then I have no problem deconstructing and personally deconstructing just their life. And so I'm just kidding. I don't do that.
Get those stickers off your hat right now.
Luke. But we've had these conversations about, what does a youth group look like in terms of its adherence to an understanding of how to think as opposed to necessarily just what to think. And we have super difficult conversations from the pulpit. I have students that interrupt me in the middle of messages for the sake of asking, a tough question if we're talking about, a homosexuality or women in leadership or whatever, the myriad of difficult issues are to discuss. And we examine those things. And so sometimes I think the best thing that I've been able to teach about, especially in these tougher Old Testament stories, is saying like, just because you see a negative example of a person in Scripture doesn't mean there isn't something that can't be learned from that.
Right.
And that's the beauty of these negative examples. We look at a person like Jonah. Okay, so, and you, as you correctly said, we treat Jonah like this, this action adventure.
That was before we started recording, yeah.
And so this action adventure story where you see, like, I remember growing up seeing Joseph in a whale that was smiling. Jonah in a whale that was smiling.
The whale or Jonah?
And the whale was smiling as Jonah was like praying there. And if we're trying to extrapolate on just even the literal ramifications of what that would look like, being slowly dissolved for 3 days in the stomach acids of a huge fish, like, I mean, those things are difficult to, take literally / understand. And so, but Jonah, again, like you were saying, just a rehashing of that is really subjugated to this understanding of like, guy wouldn't go, God made guy go, guy preaches, everybody's saved, it's all good in the end. But when you look at the story of Nineveh and Nineveh's treatment of Israel, Nineveh's relationship with Israel, Jonah's anger and just malice towards the Ninevites as they repent, his disgust with God for letting them be saved. How dare the Most High extend salvation out to people who have maliciously treated the Israelites in years past? And so,
yeah, when you read Jonah and you see the word Nineveh, here's what you have to realize. Nineveh would skin Israelites alive and blanket their flesh over their walls. Nineveh would put spikes up into the ground, tall spikes that were sharp on the end, and send people straight at them, so the spike went right through their chest and stomach, and then they just leave them there to be eaten alive by birds. These are the people that Jonah doesn't want to preach to. It's not a wacky adventure about, oh, Jonah, you should do your job. It's, no, Jonah, you're right. And why is God making you save these people? They are awful. They're awful human beings.
The single greatest evangelist in the history of humanity didn't even want to preach to these people that we look at, or the story of Lot, right? Like Lot's daughters being offered to be raped instead of the angels that come. I mean, like we never examine these things, but that are, and it's not. I don't want the listener and the friend of the podcast to think that we're just being nitpicky about the details.
Right.
These are crucial elements that contribute to the overall and the art and the trajectory of the story itself. It's not like,
don't get caught up in whether the whale really existed. That's really not the point. The point is the difficult question of how to love your neighbor, but what if your neighbor is Hitler?
Right.
Right. And really is Hitler.
yeah, ancient Hitler.
Nineveh
Ancient
is
Adolf.
Hitler.
It's a good TV show.
And God loves somebody that you hate, and you hate for good reason. Like, what does that mean? And that's the real tale, the real question of Jonah. Who cares about the fish? Fish doesn't matter.
Right. And so in my own practical viewpoint of this, I've just tried to adopt the theory of maybe overexposing there. And we've seen that work out well in terms of our connection with students who are staying in church after high school. They're coming in and saying, hey, look, because we talked about that, it wasn't new when I heard it. There wasn't a faith crisis or anything like that. But and one of the things I think is fun, as a minister of the gospel specifically for this, sometimes I have to say, I don't know. Why is that in there? Why is that tale at the end of Judges where the woman gets cut up into 7 different pieces? And why is that? Why did it happen that way?
Right.
And I just have to admit, sometimes I don't know the answer. And I think that's been the most powerful tool in my tool belt. Not to use that carelessly or flippantly or lazily of all things, but sometimes you just have to chalk that up to saying, I'm assuming, I'm a part of a belief system that's assuming an axiom about the validity of our Christianity. So.
And to that point, the Bible in places is very interested in posing questions that it has no intention of answering. There are questions in the Bible that biblical books, and those books want you to just chew on them for the rest of your life and to have to think about them.
Right, who's responsible for the death of Jesus? Right, in Mark, it is clearly God, and then by the time you get to John, it's clearly Judas. Right, we've talked like the role of God continues to diminish there, and the elevation of Judas's hand, and it becomes far greater there. I mean, so is God responsible for killing Jesus? Like, did God send Jesus to be murdered? I mean, just the idea of the difficulty of these things. Like, we have to be willing to entertain, the difficulty of our faith, because it's not an easy thing to assume, to discuss. So, you have any thoughts, Chris?
No.
All right.
Well, what I was going to say, I agree with you.
You guys covered it pretty well.
I agree with you. And the question, 100%, and I try to teach my ministry in a similar manner, is that because of developmental stages and things, I mean, 7-year-olds just aren't ready for that kind of abstract thought and that kind of, thinking. Yeah. So there has to be, that question is still there, because at what point do you start to have those types of conversations?
Well, we know that physiologically the brain begins to be able to develop and understand hypothetical questions around the age of 12. And so for me, that kind of becomes the age. When my kids are 0 to 11, and that I want to instill in them the value and the worth that they have to God, the worthiness that they are. And then as they get older, the reciprocation out of that worthiness is a life led in service to God the Father. And so that's the importance for me.
Okay. Let's answer the question, each of us, definitively. So here's my answer to the question. My answer is this. I would only teach biblical texts to kids that you're willing to teach completely and fully. Right? So a parable of Jesus, that you're willing to teach beginning to end fully without purposely sometimes we remove certain details just because it's not part of the lesson today, or remove certain details just for a pragmatic reason. But if you're removing it because you're uncomfortable, that's probably not the tale to teach this morning. So that would be my answer. Teach the parts of the Bible that you are willing to teach completely, and save the other ones for an older audience. That would be my answer.
Yeah, no, that's really good, and I'm 95% there. I'll give an example. My daughter's 3, and we went through this curriculum, I guess, called the Jesus Storybook Bible. And what it kind of does is it tells some of the the story of a lot of the Old Testament stories, and they take some liberty in the way that it concludes it, and it kind of always points us back to Jesus. But there are some difficult things. She's 3, and there's plenty of times where it's like, and this person died, and there's stories that she does not like. There's pictures. It's all illustrated by an artist, and there's a story, Jesus healing a leper, and she doesn't like that. And she'll say, I don't
The whole
like that.
human skin hanging over the walls thing had to be hard to illustrate for that guy.
Jesus on the cross is quite. It's still an illustration. It's still a kid. You can tell it's a kid's Bible, but I mean, there's blood, and we don't we don't not read those verses. But when I hear her say that, I'm like, I don't feel bad that I showed her a part of the Bible that she doesn't like. I just said, that's okay. I don't like that part either. Especially if it's a negative example what to do, and that's okay. Not to turn and force every story in the Bible to be a positive outcome, so that children will be happy when they go to bed.
Yeah.
And I'm approaching teaching from a conceptual standpoint there.
Yeah,
So when
I thought
they're
you gave a good answer.
Yeah, so when they're 0 to 11, I'm teaching in the concept realm, and then whatever stories fit in that concept realm to their totality, I'm going to teach them, particularly the ones that make me uncomfortable, because that's the only way I really know how to grow as a teacher and as an orator and communicator of stories and of traditions past, is through taking those steps that make me super uncomfortable to talk about there. So that's going to be the main thing, though. More specifically to the question, that's the main topic I'm teaching to kids that are 0 to 11, is the value that they have in the eyes of Christ. And then once they get around preteen, I'm switching that values to our response of that. So if you so you don't just create consumer Christianity. So
To the friends of the podcast, I challenge you this week to read Ezekiel 23 and teach it to somebody.
Luke.
Ezekiel 23.
Talking to you, Luke Rollins. Do that. So again, you can let us know what your own thoughts are. If you, particularly if you're a Sunday school teacher, that would be super important to me. I would like that very much, and I know all of us would. If you have anything that you disagree with or you do agree with, please feel free to comment. We would love any type of engagement. We've had a few people start kind of commenting on our posts, some of the friends making fun of me, others actually talking about serious things, so we're thankful for all comments and things that we receive.
Especially stuff making fun of Josh.
Yeah.
Very thankful.
Facebook.com/faith in whatever. Twitter, faith, the letter in whatever. Faithinwhatever.com. You can find us in all 3 of those places.